Hey there, and welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new, hit that subscribe button for spine-tingling Reddit creepypasta stories that are perfect for a night of chilling thrills. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and let's get into tonight's stories. This wasn't supposed to happen. It started as just a night hanging out with friends, a dumb way to kill some time. If I had known what we were getting into, I never would have gone along with it. Now, I'm not sure how we can stop it. It was a Saturday, nothing special. My friends, Jake, Sarah and I, were at Jake's apartment, just watching movies and messing around. The night was dragging on, and Jake, who always got restless when things got too chill, suggested something I should have seen coming. "Let's mess around with the Ouija board," Jake said, a grin on his face, like he'd come up with the best idea in the world. "I found my old one in the attic when I was cleaning last week. It's just been collecting dust. We should see if it still works." I glanced at Sarah, expecting her to be against it. She's the most skeptical of us, always rolling her eyes at anything supernatural. But to my surprise, she shrugged and said, "Sure, why not? I could use a laugh." I wasn't really feeling it, but I didn't want to be the one to bail, so I went along with it. Jake disappeared into his room and came back with the board tucked under his arm. It looked ancient, one of those old wooden ones with the faded letters and numbers. He set it down on the coffee table, and we gathered around, the atmosphere getting a little more serious, even if none of us would admit it. "All right," Jake said, rubbing his hands together. "Who wants to ask the first question?" We all hesitated. Even though none of us really believed in the paranormal, there was something about actually using a Ouija board that felt off. Like we were opening a door we shouldn't be messing with. Finally, Sarah rolled her eyes and leaned forward, placing her fingers lightly on the planchette. "Fine, I'll go first," she said. "Let's make this interesting. Are aliens real?" I snorted. Of course Sarah would go straight for the conspiracy theories. But then something strange happened. The planchette moved. At first, I thought Jake was messing with us, trying to freak us out. But the way his face paled and the slight tremble in his hands made me doubt it. The planchette slid slowly, deliberately, stopping on Y. "Okay, very funny," I said, eyeing Jake. "I swear it wasn't me," he shot back, looking genuinely freaked out. Sarah, though, was oddly calm. "Let's keep going," she said, her voice quiet. "Are they watching us?" The planchette moved again, quicker this time. It hovered over Y once more before sliding to E and then S. "Yes." My stomach twisted. This wasn't fun anymore. I pulled my fingers away from the board, and Jake followed suit, but Sarah kept her hands on the planchette, her face set in concentration. "Where are they from?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, nothing happened. The room was eerily still, the only sound the faint hum of the TV in the background. Then slowly, the planchette moved, spelling out something that didn't make any sense. N-O-U-H-E-R-E. Nowhere. We all stared at the board, trying to make sense of it. "Nowhere? What does that even mean?" Jake asked, his voice shaky. Sarah didn't answer. She just pulled her hands back, her eyes locked on the board, as if she was expecting it to move on its own. The mood in the room had shifted from playful to something far darker, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Jake tried to lighten the mood, laughing nervously. "All right, that's enough creepy stuff for one night. Let's watch something else before we all freak ourselves out." I agreed, eager to leave the weirdness of the Ouija board behind. We put on some mindless comedy, but none of us were really paying attention. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, like we'd crossed some invisible line and there was no going back. That's when it happened for the first time. One moment, we were sitting on the couch, half watching the movie, and the next, everything went blank. It was like I blinked, and suddenly, I was somewhere else. The The movie was still playing, but the credits were rolling, and my phone, which had been on the coffee table, was now in my lap with the screen lit up. I blinked, glancing at Jake and Sarah. They both looked equally confused. Jake rubbed his eyes, sitting up straighter. Did I fall asleep or something? What time is it? Sarah checked her phone. It's 1 a.m. That didn't make sense. The last time I'd looked at the clock, it was barely 11 p.m. We'd lost 2 hours. I don't remember the rest of the movie, I said slowly, my voice sounding strange in my own ears. Me neither, Sarah added, her brow furrowed. I thought I was watching it, but it's like the last 2 hours just disappeared. Jake shrugged, though I could tell he was unnerved. Maybe we all just zoned out. It's late, we're tired, but I knew that wasn't it. Something about the blank spot in my memory felt wrong, like there was a gap where time should have been. We brushed it off that night, convincing ourselves it was nothing, just one of those weird moments when you get so tired you don't realize you're nodding off. But the next morning, I woke up with a headache, a dull throbbing pain that felt like I hadn't slept at all. I texted Sarah and Jake to see how they were feeling. Sarah said she'd had the same headache, but Jake said he was fine, though his message was short, like he didn't want to talk about it. I tried to forget about the whole thing, but as the day wore on, the unease lingered. It wasn't just the headache. It was the feeling that we hadn't been alone that night, that those 2 hours weren't just a blank space, they were missing. And deep down, I knew it had something to do with the Ouija board. I wish I could say we all just moved on after that first night, but we didn't. Something had changed. That 2-hour gap, the weird responses from the Ouija board, it stuck with me like a bad dream I couldn't shake. The more I tried to ignore it, the more it gnawed at me. A couple of days went by, and I still couldn't shake the headache. Sarah and I kept texting back and forth, trying to figure out if there was something we'd missed, some logical explanation for what had happened. Jake, on the other hand, was brushing it off completely. Every time I brought it up, he'd laugh and say something like, "Dude, we just fell asleep, that's all." But I knew he was lying. You could see it in his eyes. Something had gotten under his skin too. Then, things got worse. It was a Thursday night, and we'd all decided to meet up again, this time at Sarah's place. I think part of us just wanted to prove that nothing strange had really happened, that it was all in our heads. Sarah had this big projector set up in her living room, and we were planning to watch one of those long, drawn-out sci-fi movies that we could all make fun of. Everything started out normal enough. We were about halfway through the movie, laughing at the cheesy special effects, when Sarah's phone rang. She glanced at the screen, then frowned. "It's my mum. I'll be right back," she said, getting up and disappearing into the kitchen. Jake and I kept watching the movie, but a few minutes later, I noticed something strange. The time on the screen seemed off, like the runtime of the movie didn't match up with what we'd already watched. I chalked it up to my imagination at first, but when I checked my phone, I realized we'd been sitting there for nearly an hour longer than the movie had actually played. "Hey, did you notice the time?" I asked Jake, showing him my phone. He shrugged. Probably just a glitch or something. But I wasn't convinced. Something felt off, like a weight had settled over the room, something unseen pressing down on us. I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd been sitting there longer than we thought, but I couldn't explain how. Sarah came back a few minutes later, her face pale. She sat down without saying anything, her eyes fixed on the projector screen, even though she clearly wasn't paying attention. "You all right?" I asked, glancing at her. She hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, it's just, I think my mum's losing it. She was acting weird on the phone, kept asking if I'd been gone." "Gone?" Jake asked, raising an eyebrow. Sarah nodded slowly, rubbing her forehead like her head hurt. "She said I hadn't answered my phone all day, but I didn't miss any calls. I've been home the whole time. It's like she thought I was missing or something." That word, missing, made my stomach twist. It was too close to what had happened to us, too close to that blank spot in our memories, the missing time. Jake tried to play it off like always. She's probably just confused. Happens, right? But Sarah wasn't buying it. No, she was serious. She even said she called the police because she thought something had happened to me. But I've been here the whole time. I would have known if I missed hours of my day. I didn't know what to say. This wasn't just a random phone call. It felt like whatever had started that night with the Ouija board was spreading. And Sarah wasn't the only one noticing it. That night, after I got home, things got weirder. It was around midnight, and I was getting ready for bed when I felt this sudden wave of exhaustion. It was like all the energy had drained out of me in an instant. I sat down on the edge of my bed, thinking I just needed a second to rest before lying down. But the next thing I knew, I was waking up, and it wasn't morning. The clock on my bedside table said 3 a.m. 3 hours had passed, and I had no memory of falling asleep. No dreams, no tossing and turning, just nothing. It was like I'd blinked, and 3 hours had been ripped out of my life. Panic set in, my heart racing as I tried to piece together what had happened. My phone was still on the nightstand, the screen lighting up with missed notifications. But the worst part? My window was open, and I hadn't opened it before. I shot out of bed, running to the window and slamming it shut, my hands trembling. Had someone been in my room? How long had it been open? The air outside was still, the street below silent, but the thought that something, or someone, had been watching me sent a shiver down my spine. I checked my phone, looking through my messages. There was one from Sarah, sent at 1:30 a.m. saying she couldn't sleep either. She said she felt like something was wrong, like the night was too quiet, too still. I wanted to reply, to tell her what had just happened to me, but I couldn't bring myself to type the words. Instead, I lay back down, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. There had to be an explanation for this. Sleepwalking, stress, something. But deep down, I knew it was connected to the Ouija board. We'd asked about aliens, about abductions, and now we were experiencing missing time. It was all too much to ignore. Over the next few days, it got worse. Sarah told me she'd woken up in her car one night, parked outside her house, with no memory of how she'd gotten there. She hadn't been drinking or anything, just sitting on the couch, watching TV 1 minute. And then she was outside, 2 hours later. Jake wasn't talking much. Every time we tried to bring it up, he'd change the subject, avoiding any mention of the Ouija board or the weird gaps in our time. But I could tell he was freaked out too. He wasn't sleeping, and when I saw him, there were dark circles under his eyes, like he hadn't rested in days. Then, one night, it all came crashing down. It was a Friday, and we were all back at Jake's place, trying to pretend everything was normal. We were halfway through another movie when the power went out. Just like that, the whole apartment plunged into darkness. At first, we thought it was just a power outage. Jake grabbed his flashlight, and we all sat there, waiting for the lights to come back on. But then, I noticed something strange. The clock on the microwave, the one with the red digital numbers, was still on. It said 9:45 p.m, but my phone said it was 11:15 p.m. Another gap, another hour and a half gone, without any of us noticing. We sat there in the dark, the realization hitting us all at once. This wasn't just weird gaps in time anymore. It was happening more frequently, and it was getting worse. And whatever it was coming for us. The realization that we'd lost another hour and a half hit like a punch to the gut. Jake's apartment was dark, save for the beam of his flashlight casting long, eerie shadows across the room. Sarah sat frozen on the couch, her face pale, her eyes wide. None of us spoke for what felt like minutes, each of us trying to process what had just happened. It wasn't just some random fluke anymore. This was deliberate, and it was getting closer. Whatever we'd tapped into with that Ouija board, it was reaching out, pulling us into something we didn't understand. And there was nothing we could do to stop it. Jake was the first to break the silence, his voice low and shaky. I think we need to stop pretending this is all in our heads. Sarah nodded, still staring at the microwave clock, her hands shaking slightly. How did we not notice? How did we lose another hour? I didn't have an answer. None of us did. But deep down, I knew it had to do with that night. The questions we asked the board about aliens, about abductions, it wasn't just a game. We'd opened a door, and now something had come through. Suddenly, Jake's phone buzzed. The sound was jarring in the silence, and we all jumped. He pulled it out, his face illuminated by the screen, and frowned. "It's just an Amber Alert," he said, but the uneasy look on his face didn't go away. Sarah's phone buzzed next, then mine. We all checked our screens. It was the same alert, something about a missing child in a neighbouring town. But it wasn't the alert itself that made my skin crawl. It was the timestamp. It said the alert had been sent out over an hour ago at 9:45 p.m. The exact moment our time had gone missing. I felt a knot form in my stomach. "It's happening again, isn't it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Jake didn't answer. He just stood up, his face pale, and started pacing around the room. "We need to figure out what's happening. This isn't just missing time anymore. It feels like we're being watched." Sarah shuddered. "Don't say that." But she wasn't wrong. That heavy feeling, the one that had settled over us the first time we lost time, was back, thicker than ever. It was like the air itself had become a weight pressing down on us, suffocating, making it hard to think, hard to move. Every instinct in my body was screaming that we weren't alone, that something was watching us from the shadows, waiting. "We need to go," Jake said suddenly, his voice tight with urgency. "We need to get out of here." "Go where?" Sarah asked, standing up, her voice trembling. "It doesn't matter where we are. It's following us." "Just get in the car," Jake snapped, grabbing his keys from the counter. "We can't just sit here waiting for it to happen again." He was right. As much as I didn't want to admit it, I knew we couldn't stay in that apartment. Every second we spent there felt like we were giving whatever was after us more time, more control. I grabbed my jacket, and we all rushed out the door, Jake locking up behind us, like that would make any difference. We piled into Jake's car, the unease growing with each passing second. As soon as we were all inside, he started the engine, his hands shaking slightly as he gripped the steering wheel. "Where are we going?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Jake glanced in the rearview mirror, his face pale. "I don't know. Away from here. Somewhere. Somewhere it can't find us." We pulled out of the driveway, the dark streets eerily quiet as we drove through the neighborhood. There were no cars, no people. Just empty streets, bathed in the dim light of the occasional street lamp. The silence was oppressive, like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As we drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see something moving in the shadows, something keeping pace with us. But the streets were empty. Jake kept driving, the tension in the car thick enough to cut with a knife. No one spoke. We didn't have to. We all felt it, the sense that we were being hunted. After what felt like hours, Jake pulled over in front of an old diner on the edge of town. It was one of those places that looked like it hadn't changed in 50 years, with neon signs flickering weakly in the window. The parking lot was empty, and the lights inside were dim, but the thought of sitting in the car any longer was unbearable. "Let's just get some coffee," Jake muttered, getting out of the car. We followed him inside, the bell above the door jingling as we entered. The place was mostly empty, save for a tired-looking waitress behind the counter and an older couple in a booth at the far end. We sat down in one of the booths, the worn leather seats creaking under our weight. The waitress came over, taking our orders, but I barely heard what anyone said. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening, trying to figure out if there was any way to stop it. But every thought led back to the same terrifying conclusion. We'd started something we couldn't control, and now it was coming for us. As we waited for our coffee, Jake pulled out his phone, scrolling through the news. He looked tense, his eyes flicking back and forth across the screen. "Anything?" Sarah asked, her voice soft. Jake shook his head. "Just more reports of people going missing. It's not just here though, it's happening all over. The missing time, the gaps in memory. It's spreading." I felt a chill run down my spine. "You think it's all connected?" Jake didn't answer, but the look on his face said it all. Whatever was happening to us wasn't isolated. It was part of something bigger, something far more terrifying. Our coffee arrived, but none of us touched it. We just sat there, staring at the table, the oppressive silence hanging over us like a storm cloud. Then, suddenly, Sarah's phone buzzed on the table. She picked it up, frowning. "It's my mum again," she said, her voice tense. "She's been calling me all day." She answered, putting the phone to her ear. "Mum?" For a moment, her face was calm, listening. But then, her expression changed. Her eyes went wide, her face drained of color, and she slowly lowered the phone from her ear. "What is it?" I asked, my heart pounding. "She said I've been missing for 2 days." The words hung in the air, cold and suffocating. "What do you mean?" Jake asked, his voice sharp. Sarah shook her head, her hands trembling as she stared at her phone. "She said I haven't answered any of her calls or texts since Tuesday, but I've been with you guys this whole time. I've only missed, I don't know, a few hours at most." Panic surged through me. 2 days. How was that even possible? Jake pulled out his phone, checking the date. His face went pale. "Sarah's right. It's Friday," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "We've been missing for 2 days." I grabbed my phone, checking the date, praying it was some kind of glitch. But there it was, staring back at me in cold, unforgiving numbers. Friday. We had lost 2 entire days. The realization hit me like a freight train, knocking the breath from my lungs. We hadn't just lost hours anymore. We were losing days. Time was slipping away from us faster and faster, and we didn't even realize it. Before I could say anything, a low, vibrating hum filled the diner. At first, I thought it was something mechanical. Maybe the air conditioner or the hum of the fluorescent lights. But then, the hum grew louder, deeper, filling the room with a sound that made my teeth vibrate in my skull. The older couple in the booth at the back looked up, confused. The waitress glanced around, frowning, like she couldn't figure out where the noise was coming from. Then the lights flickered. The hum grew louder, almost unbearable, vibrating through the floor, the table, my bones. And just as suddenly as it started, everything went dark. The lights, the hum, the entire diner, it all vanished into the blackness. For a moment, there was nothing, just silence. And then, the missing time came for us again. When I came to, I was outside the diner. The night air was cold against my skin, and my head was pounding like I'd been slammed into the pavement. I blinked, trying to get my bearings. I could see Jake and Sarah standing nearby, their expressions frozen in confusion, like they couldn't quite process where they were or how they had gotten there. The diner behind us was dark. No flickering neon signs, no lights from inside. The place looked abandoned, like it had been that way for years. The street around us was deserted. No cars, no people, no sounds except for the wind whistling through the empty parking lot. "What the hell just happened?" Jake's voice cracked as he finally spoke. I tried to remember, but it was like trying to grab hold of smoke. We'd been sitting in the diner, then the hum, the lights flickering, and then nothing. Blank. Another gap in time, this one more disorienting than the last. "We blacked out again," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "We lost more time." I checked my phone, my hands shaking. The clock read 2:13 a.m. It had been a little after 11 when we sat down in the diner. That meant 3 hours had slipped away. 3 hours, just gone. Jake was pacing now, running his hands through his hair. "I don't get it. How are we outside? How did we get here?" None of us had any answers. Every time we thought we could make sense of what was happening, reality twisted itself into something more unsettling, more impossible. The gaps were getting longer, and the sense of something watching us, of being hunted, was growing stronger. "We need to figure this out," Sarah said, her voice shaky. "We can't keep losing time like this. It's getting worse." As she spoke, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something bigger, that the Ouija board wasn't the start of this, just a piece of it. Whatever we'd tapped into had already been watching us, waiting for the right moment to make its move. And now it was closing in. I turned to Jake. "We need to retrace our steps, figure out where we went during those gaps. Maybe there's something we're not seeing, something that's happening when we black out." Jake nodded, though he looked skeptical. "And how exactly do we do that? We don't even know what's happening to us." "We have to start somewhere," I said, though I wasn't sure where that would be. "Think about it. It started after we asked the Ouija board about aliens, right? That's when the time loss began. Maybe there's a connection. Maybe something is messing with us every time we lose those hours." Sarah bit her lip, her fear visible. "You mean like abductions?" The word hung in the air like a weight, and none of us could shake the thought. It was the one thing that made sense in this bizarre, terrifying situation. The gaps in time, the missing memories, the strange sensations. Everything pointed to something out of our control, something watching us and waiting for the right moments to strike. "We need to keep moving," I said, trying to shake the sense of dread that had settled over us. "If we stay out here, whatever's happening could happen again." Jake agreed. We got back into his car, the engine rumbling to life as we pulled away from the diner. The roads were empty, eerily still, like the world had been drained of life while we'd been stuck in that missing time. As we drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that the gaps weren't random anymore. They were timed, deliberate. Every time we lost hours, it was happening faster, closer together. It wasn't just random moments of missing time. It was like someone or something was controlling it, experimenting on us, seeing how much time it could take before we noticed. And then, out of nowhere, my phone buzzed. It wasn't a call, it was a notification. Another Amber Alert, just like the one we'd received earlier in the diner. But this one was different. The alert wasn't about a missing child. It was about us. The notification read, "Amber Alert, 3 adults missing, last seen at diner off Route 35. My blood ran cold. I stared at the screen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. "Guys, you need to look at this." Jake glanced over at my phone, his eyes widening as he saw the alert. "What the—" "It's us," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's talking about us." I felt my heart racing, panic bubbling up in my chest. This wasn't just some strange phenomenon happening to a few unlucky people. We were part of something much bigger, and now the world was aware of it. But how? How could we be missing when we were right here? Before I could say anything, the headlights of Jake's car flickered, just for a second. Then the engine sputtered, coughing like it was choking on air. Jake cursed under his breath, trying to keep the car steady, but it was too late. The car rolled to a stop in the middle of the road, the dashboard lights dimming as the engine died. Jake slammed his fist against the steering wheel. "What the hell is happening?" The silence that followed was thick and oppressive. We sat there, frozen, unsure of what to do. The air outside seemed heavier, the night darker than before. And then, that low hum returned. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, more intense, vibrating through the car like some kind of primal force. The sound wasn't coming from the car, it was coming from above us. "Do you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. I nodded, my pulse quickening. "It's the same sound from the diner." We all looked up, instinctively craning our necks to peer through the windshield. And that's when we saw it. A light. Bright, white, and blinding. It hovered above us, high in the sky, like some kind of spotlight shining down on our car. The hum intensified, vibrating through my skull, making it impossible to think. "We need to move," Jake said, his voice tight with fear. "Get out of the car." But before any of us could react, the light pulsed. One blinding flash. Then everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I was lying in a field. The night was still, the stars above twinkling like nothing had happened. But the weight in my chest told me otherwise. I sat up, my head spinning, trying to make sense of where I was. Sarah and Jake were beside me, both of them slowly stirring, their faces pale and confused. "What just happened?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind was still reeling from the flash, from the sudden shift in reality. We weren't near the road anymore. The car was gone. The lights were gone. And somehow, we were lying in a field in the middle of nowhere. "Check the time," Jake muttered, his voice hoarse. I pulled out my phone, my heart sinking as I looked at the screen. 4:30 a.m. We'd lost another 2 hours. Panic set in, a wave of nausea rolling through me. We hadn't just blacked out. We'd been moved, taken. And whatever had taken us was playing with us, bending time, shifting reality in ways that didn't make sense. "I can't do this anymore," Sarah said, her voice cracking. "We have to stop this. We have to find a way out." Jake nodded, his face grim. "We will. But first, we need to figure out where the hell we are." I stood up, my legs shaky beneath me. The field stretched out in all directions, dark and empty, with no signs of civilization anywhere in sight. Then, in the distance, I saw it. A shape. A figure. Standing at the edge of the field, watching us. The figure stood at the edge of the field, motionless, bathed in the pale glow of the moonlight. It was too far away to make out any details, but its presence was undeniable. We all saw it at the same time. None of us spoke, but I could feel the terror spreading between us like a ripple, an unspoken understanding that whatever or whoever was watching us was not here by chance. "We need to go," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. He was already backing away, his eyes never leaving the figure. But I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the spot, and my mind was racing, trying to piece together the fragments of time that had been slipping through our fingers. Every time we blacked out, every moment we lost, it had been there, watching us, taking us. Sarah grabbed my arm, her grip tight. "Come on," she urged, her voice shaky. "We need to leave." I forced myself to nod, and we began to move, slowly at first, then faster. Jake led the way, pushing through the tall grass, his breathing ragged. My heart pounded in my chest, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting the figure to follow, to close the distance between us. But when I looked back, it hadn't moved. It just stood there, watching. We reached the edge of the field and found a narrow dirt road. There was no sign of the car, no indication of how we'd ended up here. It was as if the world had shifted around us, placing us in this isolated, desolate place. "We have to keep moving," Jake said, his voice tight with urgency. "We need to find help." We started down the road, the cold night air biting at our skin. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the sound of our footsteps crunching on the dirt. Every step felt heavier, like the weight of what had happened was pressing down on us, slowing us down, making it harder to move. Sarah suddenly stopped, her face pale. "Did you hear that?" We all froze, listening. At first, I didn't hear anything, just the rustling of the wind through the trees. But then, there it was, a faint low hum. The same hum we'd heard before, the one that had preceded every blackout, every moment of missing time. Jake's eyes widened in panic. "It's coming back. We need to run," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "We can't let it take us again." but it was too late. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the ground beneath our feet, sending a sickening shiver up my spine. I turned to Jake, desperate for a plan, for something that would get us out of this nightmare. But Jake just stood there, staring up at the sky, his face twisted in fear. Then I saw it. The light. That same blinding white light from before, hovering above us, growing brighter by the second. It was like the sky itself had opened up, swallowing us in its radiance. The hum grew deafening, drowning out everything else, making it impossible to think. I tried to run, to move, but my legs wouldn't respond. My body felt heavy, as if the very air around me had thickened, trapping me in place. Jake and Sarah were frozen too, their eyes wide with terror. The light pulsed again, and I felt it. Time slipping away. I knew without a doubt that we were about to lose more time, that when we came back, hours or days or weeks could be gone, and we wouldn't even know what had happened during that void. But then, something changed. The figure from the field, the one that had been watching us, it appeared in the light. I could barely make out its features through the glare, but it was there, moving toward us, reaching out with something that resembled a hand. It didn't feel like a person. It didn't even feel human. I wanted to scream, to shout for help, but my voice was caught in my throat. The light grew blinding, and my vision began to blur, the world spinning around me. Then, everything went black. When I woke up, the sun was rising. I was lying on the side of the road, the dirt cold and damp beneath me. My head throbbed, and my mouth was dry. I sat up slowly, blinking against the harsh morning light, trying to remember what had happened. But the memories were fractured, scattered like broken glass. I glanced around, my heart racing. Sarah was there, sitting a few feet away, her knees pulled up to her chest. She was staring at the ground, her face pale, her eyes hollow. She didn't even acknowledge that I was awake. "Sarah," I called, my voice hoarse. She looked up slowly, her expression blank, like she was still trapped in the nightmare we'd just escaped from. "Where's Jake?" I asked, glancing around, suddenly realizing we were alone. Sarah shook her head, her voice barely audible. "He's gone." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean, he's gone? Where did he go?" "I don't know," she whispered, her voice cracking. "When I woke up, he wasn't here. He just disappeared." Panic surged through me. I stood up, spinning around, searching the empty road, the field beyond. There was no sign of him, no trace that he'd ever been with us. I checked my phone, my hands shaking. The time read 6:47 a.m. We'd lost another 3 hours. But Jake wasn't the only thing missing. The Amber Alert, the one that had been about us, was gone from my phone, like it had never been there. There were no notifications, no missed calls, no texts. It was as if we'd been erased from the world for those missing hours, and no one even realized we'd been gone. "Sarah," I said, my voice trembling. "We need to leave. We need to get out of here." She nodded, but she didn't move. I could see it in her eyes, the same fear that was consuming me. We weren't safe. We never had been. Whatever had taken Jake, it wasn't finished with us. We walked in silence, following the road until we finally reached a gas station on the outskirts of town. The man behind the counter didn't ask any questions when we asked for a phone. He didn't even seem to notice how disheveled we looked, like he'd seen this kind of thing before. Maybe he had. I called my brother, asking him to pick us up, my voice shaking with every word. When he finally arrived, I didn't have the strength to explain what had happened. I couldn't. It sounded too insane, too impossible. And yet, it had all been real. As we drove away from that place, I couldn't stop thinking about Jake, about the missing time, about the figure in the light. I still don't know where Jake is. I don't know if we'll ever see him again. But I do know one thing. the gaps are getting longer. The moments of missing time, they're not just random, they're getting worse. And I'm terrified of what will happen when the next gap comes, because I don't think we'll come back from it. You know how everyone talks about Ouija boards like they're just a game? It's one of those things you see at sleepovers or in cheesy horror movies, but no one really takes it seriously, right? I used to think that way too, until a few weeks ago. It all started with one of those boring nights where there was nothing to do and we were all sitting around my friend Matt's place. There were 4 of us, me, Matt, his girlfriend Emily, and our other buddy Jake. We'd exhausted all the usual options. No one felt like watching TV or playing video games, and we were just bored. That's when Emily, with her usual mischievous grin, pulled out a dusty old Ouija board from the back of Matt's closet. I don't even know how it ended up there. Matt claimed he'd never seen it before, but Emily was all in. She was always into spooky stuff, watching true crime documentaries and paranormal videos online. The rest of us, not so much. "Come on," Emily said, her eyes lighting up like she was planning something big. "Let's see if we can talk to someone from the other side." Jake laughed, but there was an edge to it. "Oh, great. Yeah, let's summon a demon or something. This is how all the bad horror movies start." "I don't know if this is a good idea," Matt mumbled, looking at me for backup. But I wasn't in the mood to be the killjoy, and part of me was curious. What was the worst that could happen? A few laughs and some awkward silences while the planchette didn't move seemed harmless enough. We gathered around the coffee table, dimmed the lights a little, because of course, Emily insisted, and placed our fingers lightly on the planchette. The room felt different, but not in a spooky way. It was just the tension of doing something that, deep down, we all knew was a little ridiculous. But that's how it always starts, right? Thinking it's no big deal until it is. Emily started with the usual questions. "Is anyone here with us? And can you give us a sign?" At first, nothing happened, just as we expected. Jake chuckled under his breath, muttering about how we were wasting our time. But then the planchette moved. Slowly, we all stopped laughing and looked at each other, wide-eyed. Matt frowned. "Okay, who's messing with it?" But no one said anything. No one took their fingers off the planchette. Emily looked as surprised as the rest of us, but there was something in her eyes that told me she wasn't scared. She was excited. The planchette started moving again, quicker this time, spelling out letters. BLACKSITE. We all exchanged glances, completely confused. "What the hell is a black site?" I asked, pulling out my phone to Google it. The results didn't make me feel any better. It's like a secret government facility, a place where they do stuff off the record, like interrogations, or worse. Jake scoffed, though his voice wavered slightly. "Okay, seriously, who's moving this thing? Emily, is this some kind of joke?" "I'm not doing anything," she shot back, her face pale now. "I swear it's not me." Matt, ever the logical one, took a deep breath. "All right, maybe we should just stop. This is getting weird." But of course we didn't stop. Something about it felt unfinished. Emily asked another question, her voice trembling just a little now. "What kind of black site? Where is it?" The planchette didn't move right away, and for a second I thought maybe we were done. But then, slowly, it started to spell again. NOTSAFE. Not safe. "What's not safe?" Matt asked, clearly rattled. "This is getting ridiculous." The room felt different now. The air seemed heavier, like it was pressing down on us, suffocating in a way that was hard to describe. I could feel a pit forming in my stomach, the kind you get when you realize something's gone too far. But no one was willing to say it out loud. Emily, despite her fear, pushed further. "Who are you? How do you know about this?" Again, the planchette moved, but this time it was faster, almost frantic. "STOP. The candles on the coffee table flickered violently, and I could feel the temperature in the room drop. Jake pulled his hands away from the board, shaking his head. I'm done. This is too much. Matt stood up too, but before we could pack the board away, my phone buzzed. I glanced down at the screen, expecting a random notification. But what I saw made my blood run cold. It was a message. No number, no name, just 2 words. Stop now. I showed it to the others, my hands trembling. This just came through. Right after the board said stop. Emily's eyes widened, and she quickly checked her own phone. I got the same thing. Jake snatched his phone off the table and stared at it in disbelief. Me too. Matt, looking more shaken than I'd ever seen him, checked his phone last. His face turned white as he held up the screen for us to see. The message wasn't just 2 words for him. It was longer, more direct. You've been warned. If you keep asking, there will be consequences. We all sat there, staring at each other, the weight of what we'd just done sinking in. This wasn't some prank. This wasn't someone in the room messing with us. Whoever, or whatever, was connected to that Ouija board knew something. Something dangerous. Matt stood up abruptly, grabbing the Ouija board and throwing it back into the closet. That's it. We're done. No more questions. We never talk about this again. But even as he said it, I could feel it deep in my gut. It was already too late. The next few days after that Ouija board session were strange, to say the least. We didn't talk about what had happened. Not really. Matt was adamant that we put it behind us, but I could tell it was still weighing on everyone's mind. The whole thing had left a bad taste, like we'd seen something we weren't supposed to. I figured if we just moved on, it would all fade away. But it didn't. It was a Wednesday evening, a couple of days after that night. I was in the middle of a late shift at work when my phone rang. It wasn't a number I recognized, but I didn't think much of it. Probably just a scam call or something. I almost didn't answer, but some gut instinct told me to pick up. Hello? There was a pause on the other end. At first I thought maybe the line was dead, just one of those weird silent calls. But then I heard it. Stop asking questions. It was a voice, cold, mechanical, almost robotic. Like someone had filtered it through a machine. My blood froze. It wasn't just the words, but the way they were delivered, almost like a command. What? Who is this? I stammered, my heart suddenly pounding. The line went dead. I stared at my phone, my hand shaking. For a moment, I thought about calling Matt or Emily, but I hesitated. Maybe it was just a prank. Some random weirdo who somehow got my number. It had to be, right? I mean, there was no way this had anything to do with the Ouija board. That was impossible. But as I stood there, trying to calm myself down, another text came through. You've been warned. No sender. No details. Just that. I felt a chill creep up my spine. My first thought was to call Emily. If she got the same text, then it had to be more than just a coincidence. I dialed her number, praying she'd pick up quickly. When she finally answered, her voice was tense. Did you get another one too? I froze. Wait, you got something? She sighed, her voice shaky. Yeah, a call, just now. It said the same thing. Stop asking questions. I could hear the fear in her voice. She was trying to keep it together, but I could tell this was freaking her out just as much as it was me. Do you think it's about the board? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't even want to say it out loud, but it was like we both knew what this was leading to. I don't know, she replied, but it can't be a coincidence. None of us have talked about that night since it happened. But what if we're not the only ones involved now? The thought hit me hard. If someone or something had reached out to us through the board, could it have opened a door, let something in? We didn't talk about it, but that didn't mean whatever was listening had forgotten about us. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear that voice in my head, repeating the same words over and over. Stop asking questions. You've been warned. What did that even mean? Warned about what? The next morning, I got another call. This time, it wasn't just the voice. It was worse. You're being watched. That's all it said before the line went dead again. The fear started sinking in deeper. If this was some prank, it was getting way too personal. The idea that someone, or something, was keeping an eye on me made my skin crawl. I glanced out my window, half expecting to see someone standing on the street, watching the house. But the street was empty. Still, the feeling that I was being observed never left. Later that day, I finally reached out to Matt and Jake. I needed to know if they were going through the same thing. If these calls were just happening to me and Emily, or if it was all of us. Matt didn't sound surprised when I called him. In fact, he sounded almost resigned, like he'd been expecting this. Yeah, he said quietly. I've been getting them too. Calls, texts, all of it. I thought it would stop if we didn't talk about it, but it's like it's getting worse. What do they want? I asked, though I wasn't sure he had any more answers than I did. I don't know, Matt said, his voice low. But I think we made a mistake. Jake, on the other hand, didn't believe it. When I called him, he brushed the whole thing off, insisting it was probably some weird coincidence. He hadn't gotten any calls yet, and he figured we were just spooking ourselves. Typical Jake, always the skeptic. You guys are overthinking this, he said. It's just a bunch of random numbers messing with you. Happens all the time. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But the way those calls felt, the cold precision of the words, the way the text came with no sender, no trace, it was hard to chalk it up to something random. Deep down, I knew there was something more to it. Something darker. That night, I decided to turn off my phone. I couldn't handle another call, another reminder that someone was watching me. I needed sleep. But even with the phone off, the unease didn't leave me. The house felt too quiet, too still. Every creak of the floorboards, every soft hum of the fridge in the kitchen, it all felt wrong, like the air itself was pressing in around me. Around 2 a.m., the silence was broken by a knock at the door. My heart jumped into my throat. Who would be at my door in the middle of the night? I thought about ignoring it, but the knocking came again, louder this time. I got out of bed, my hands shaking as I grabbed my phone. I turned it back on, ready to call someone, anyone. But before I could dial, a text came through. Answer the door. I froze. This wasn't just some prank. This wasn't random. They knew I was here. They knew I hadn't answered. And now they were waiting. The knocking came again, more insistent. I didn't move. I just stood there, staring at the door, my mind racing. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to know who or what was on the other side. But I could feel it. Whoever was out there wasn't leaving until I did. The knocking grew louder, more forceful, like whoever or whatever was on the other side was losing patience. I stood frozen in place, staring at the door, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. My phone buzzed again, and when I looked down, another text appeared on the screen. You're running out of time. My throat tightened. I wanted to ignore it, to pretend that if I just stayed quiet long enough, whoever was out there would leave. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't going away. I glanced at the peephole, my heart racing. If I just took a look, maybe I could figure out who it was. Maybe it was just some stupid prank after all. But even as I told myself that, I knew it couldn't be. The timing, the calls, the texts, it all added up to something far more sinister. Slowly, I made my way to the door, every step feeling heavier than the last. My hand shook as I reached for the peephole, and when I looked through it, my blood ran cold. There was no one there. The hallway outside my apartment was empty, completely still, but the knocking hadn't stopped. It was still coming from the door, loud and insistent, even though there was no one standing on the other side. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't normal. Nothing about this was normal. I wasn't dealing with a prank anymore. I was dealing with something I couldn't explain, something that was way beyond my control. Before I could think about what to do next, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse, a suffocating quiet that made the air feel thick and heavy. I stood there, waiting, my entire body tense. Then my phone buzzed again. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I glanced down at the screen, dread pooling in my stomach. We're inside. The air in the room seemed to shift, growing colder, and a wave of nausea washed over me. Inside. I spun around, eyes darting to every corner of the room. There was no one here, no sign of anyone entering, but the words kept echoing in my head. We're inside. My instincts screamed at me to run, but where could I go? The apartment felt like a trap, the walls closing in around me. I didn't know what to do, so I grabbed my phone, my hands trembling, and dialed Matt. He was the only one I could think to call. If anyone could help me make sense of this, it was him. The phone rang once, twice, and then I heard Matt's voice on the other end. But something was wrong. His voice wasn't calm like I had hoped. It was frantic, almost panicked. "Man, what's going on?" he said, his words coming out in a rush. "I've been getting calls too, texts, threats. I've seen people outside my house, just standing there. This is bad. This is really bad." Hearing Matt panicked only made things worse. "Someone was just at my door," I said, my voice barely steady. "I didn't open it, but they said they're inside. I don't know what to do." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and for a moment, I thought maybe Matt had hung up. But then, his voice came back, quieter now. "We never should have touched that board. It wasn't a game. It was something else. I've been doing some research, and the more I dig, the worse it gets." "What are you talking about?" I asked, the knot in my stomach tightening. "I found something," Matt said, his voice trembling. "Something about black sites, government projects, classified stuff. It's all connected to what the board told us." Project Midnight. I froze. "Project Midnight," Matt continued, his words rushing out like he was afraid to stop. "It was some kind of experiment. They were testing on people, mind control, interrogation, stuff they didn't want the public to know about. The people involved, they disappeared. And anyone who asked too many questions, they vanished too." My head was spinning. "What does that have to do with us?" I think... Matt hesitated. "I think we stumbled onto something we weren't supposed to. When the board told us about the black site, it wasn't just some random message. We connected to something real, something dangerous. And now they know we're onto them." "Who? The government?" "Maybe," Matt said, his voice low. "Or something worse. I don't know for sure, but whatever it is, it's coming after us." I swallowed hard, my heart racing. "What do we do?" There was a pause, and then Matt said the words I didn't want to hear. "I don't think there's anything we can do. They've been watching us since that night. The calls, the texts, it's all part of it. We're on their radar now." Just as he finished speaking, my phone buzzed again. I glanced down at the screen and felt my stomach drop. There's nowhere to hide. I didn't even have time to react before the lights in my apartment flickered. The room plunged into darkness, and the air grew colder, almost suffocating. My heart was pounding so hard, I could barely hear anything over the sound of my own blood rushing in my ears. "Matt," I whispered into the phone, "the lights just went out." "Get out of there," Matt said, his voice sharp with panic. "Now, leave the apartment. Don't look back." I grabbed my keys, bolted toward the door, and yanked it open. The hallway outside was empty, just as it had been when I checked the peephole. But something felt wrong. The air was thick, oppressive, like the darkness was alive, pressing in from all sides. I stepped out into the hallway, my heart racing, and made a beeline for the stairwell. My footsteps echoed loudly in the silence, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I had to get out of there. As I reached the stairwell, I glanced over my shoulder, just for a split second. That's when I saw it. A shadow, darker than the rest of the hallway, moving toward me. It wasn't walking. It wasn't running. It was gliding, like it was part of the darkness itself, like it was feeding off the shadows. I ran, faster than I ever thought I could, my heart pounding in my chest, my legs burning as I flew down the stairs. I didn't stop until I reached the front door of the building, bursting out into the cool night air. But even out there, I didn't feel safe. The streetlights flickered above me, casting long shadows on the ground, and that same oppressive feeling hung in the air. My phone buzzed again. "You can't run from us." I stood on the street, panting, trying to catch my breath. My hands were trembling. My legs felt like jelly, and my mind was racing with 1,000 thoughts I couldn't untangle. The phone in my hand buzzed again, but I didn't look this time. I didn't need to. The message was already burned into my brain. You can't run from us. The air outside wasn't much better than it had been in the hallway. It felt heavy, like it was pushing down on me. The street was eerily empty, the kind of quiet that sets your nerves on edge. The lights flickered overhead, casting long, warped shadows that seemed to stretch out toward me. I wanted to believe it was just the wind, but I knew better now. I dialed Matt again, my fingers shaking as I brought the phone to my ear. It rang once, twice, and then went straight to voicemail. I cursed under my breath. What was going on? Had they gotten to him too? I tried calling Emily next. She answered on the first ring. "Where are you?" she asked, her voice frantic. "I've been getting texts, calls, everything. Someone's been outside my house all night. I don't know what to do." I glanced up and down the empty street, searching for any sign of movement. "I'm outside my apartment. I had to leave." They were inside, Emily." Her voice trembled on the other end of the line. "I think we're being followed. Everywhere I go, I feel like someone's watching me. This isn't just random. They're targeting us because of that night." I leaned against the side of a building, trying to gather my thoughts. Matt mentioned something called Project Midnight. Something about black sites and people disappearing. He thinks it's all connected to that, but I don't know what's real anymore. There was a long pause on the other end before Emily spoke again, her voice low. I looked it up. Project Midnight was a secret government operation. They were running tests on people, illegal tests, off the books, in these black sites. The people who got involved, the ones who started asking too many questions, they were silenced, erased. That's what the board was trying to tell us. The weight of her words hit me like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just some paranormal warning. We had stumbled onto something real, something dangerous. And now, whoever was behind it knew that we knew. "We need to find Matt," I said, the panic rising in my voice. "I think they might have already gotten to him." Emily agreed, and we made plans to meet up at Matt's house. It was the only place we could think to go. I hung up and started walking, sticking to the shadows as I moved. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone, or something, was lurking just beyond my line of sight. As I made my way through the quiet streets, my phone buzzed again. Reluctantly, I pulled it out and checked the message. "You're getting closer." My stomach twisted. They were tracking me. Every step I took, every turn I made. It was like they knew exactly where I was headed. I wanted to throw my phone into the nearest storm drain, but part of me knew it wouldn't matter. They were already one step ahead. The closer I got to Matt's place, the worse the feeling got. The streetlights flickered out completely, plunging the road into near total darkness. My only light was the dim glow of my phone screen. I thought about turning back, about hiding somewhere, until this all blew over, but deep down, I knew that wasn't an option. They weren't going to stop until they had what they wanted. When I finally reached Matt's house, something felt wrong. All the lights were off, the windows dark. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest, and knocked on the door. No answer. I tried the handle. It was unlocked. I stepped inside, the air thick with that same oppressive heaviness I'd felt in my apartment. The house was eerily quiet. Too quiet. I called out Matt's name, but there was no response. Emily arrived a few minutes later, her face pale and drawn. She stepped inside, glancing around nervously. "Where is he?" "I don't know," I whispered. "He's not answering his phone." We moved through the house, searching every room, but there was no sign of Matt. No overturned furniture, no signs of a struggle, nothing. It was like he had just vanished. The only thing that stood out was the chilling quiet, the kind that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. Emily checked her phone, her face paling even more as she showed me the screen. He's not coming back. We both stood frozen, the realization sinking in. They had taken him, just like the others who had asked too many questions. And now we were next. Before I could process what was happening, my phone buzzed again. "Time's up." The lights in the house flickered, and the temperature seemed to drop by several degrees in an instant. Emily and I both spun around, our eyes darting to the windows, the doors, any possible escape route. But something told me it wouldn't matter. They were already here. We heard it then. A faint hum, growing louder. The same sound I'd heard in my apartment, only this time, it was everywhere. It reverberated through the walls, the floor, making the air feel electric, alive with something dark. I grabbed Emily's arm. "We need to get out of here." We bolted for the front door, but before we could reach it, the lights went out completely. The house was plunged into darkness, the hum growing louder, more intense. I could feel it in my chest, vibrating through my bones like it was inside me. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the hum stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. We stood there, our backs pressed against the door, too scared to move. My heart was racing so hard, I thought it might explode. I reached for the door handle, but just as my hand closed around it, a voice spoke from the darkness. "You shouldn't have asked." It wasn't coming from the phone. It was coming from inside the house, somewhere deep in the shadows. Emily let out a gasp, backing away from the door. "We have to go! Now!" But I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, frozen by the voice. It was the same one I'd heard in the calls, the same cold mechanical tone that sent chills down my spine. But this time, it was right there, in the room with us. I turned slowly, my eyes straining to see through the darkness. And then I saw it, a figure, tall, shadowy, its face obscured by the darkness, was standing in the corner of the room, watching us. I don't know how long we stood there, staring at it, waiting for it to move, to do something. But it didn't. It just watched. The only thing I could think to do was run. I grabbed Emily's arm and yanked the door open, pulling her outside into the cold night air. We didn't stop running until we were halfway down the street, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. When we finally stopped, I looked back. The house was dark, silent, but I could still feel it. The presence. Watching, waiting. My phone buzzed one last time. "We'll be seeing you soon." We didn't stop running until we reached the edge of town, out of breath, barely able to speak. Emily was trembling, and I wasn't doing much better. My mind raced with thoughts of that figure standing in the shadows of Matt's house, the way it seemed to watch us without moving. I didn't know if it was a person, something supernatural, or something even worse. All I knew was that whatever it wasn't human. We found a spot by an old gas station, far enough from the lights of the town, but still close enough to civilization that we didn't feel completely abandoned. The air was cold and biting, but at least out here, We felt some distance from the thing that had been following us. I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath. "They know everything," Emily said quietly, her voice shaking. "Everywhere we go, they're ahead of us. We can't escape them." She was right. No matter where we went, no matter how fast we ran, they always knew. It wasn't just the calls or the texts anymore. It was the presence, the feeling of being constantly watched. It was like we had stumbled into a web we couldn't break free from. "We need to figure out what they want," I said, more to myself than to Emily. "We need to stop running and face this. Maybe there's something we missed, something that can help us." Emily looked at me like I was insane. "Are you serious? They're hunting us, and you want to figure out what they want? They're going to kill us." "I don't know what else to do," I snapped, my voice rising. "We can't keep running forever. Matt's gone. Jake's not answering his phone. It's just us now. We need to find a way to end this." She fell silent, her eyes filled with fear. I knew what I was suggesting didn't make any sense, but nothing made sense anymore. We were being hunted by something that defied explanation, something that had been set in motion the moment we touched that Ouija board. The more I thought about it, the more I realized we needed answers, and there was only one way to get them. "We need to go back," I said, the words coming out before I could stop myself. Emily's eyes widened. "Back? To the board? You can't be serious." I nodded, my heart racing. "We started this with the board. Maybe it's the only way we can end it." She shook her head, backing away from me. No way. That's what got us into this mess in the first place." "I know," I said, stepping toward her. "But if we don't get answers, they'll keep coming for us. It doesn't matter where we go, they'll find us. We need to understand what they want, what this is all about." Emily looked at me, torn between fear and desperation. Finally, she nodded, though I could see the terror in her eyes. "All right, let's do it. But if anything happens, we leave. We don't push it. Agreed?" "Agreed." We made our way back to Matt's place, our footsteps echoing in the empty streets. The town felt even more deserted now, like the world had folded in on itself, leaving just the two of us to face whatever was waiting. As we approached the house, that familiar sense of dread returned, wrapping around me like a cold shroud. The house was dark, just as we had left it, but I knew we weren't alone. We stepped inside, the silence almost unbearable. The Ouija board was still in Matt's closet, buried under some old clothes and boxes. I grabbed it, my hands shaking, and brought it out to the living room, where we set it on the coffee table. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The room felt heavy, like the air itself was weighing us down. I could feel the presence again, watching, waiting. "Are you sure about this?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded. "We need to know." We placed our fingers on the planchette, just as we had that first night. My heart pounded in my chest, my skin crawling with the sensation of being watched. Emily's hand trembled, but she didn't pull away. "Is anyone here?" I asked, my voice shaky. At first, nothing happened. The planchette didn't move. The room stayed silent, oppressive. I glanced at Emily, about to say something, when suddenly the planchette jerked to life, sliding across the board. YES. My breath caught in my throat. We weren't alone. Emily's eyes were wide with fear, but she didn't speak. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my voice. "What do you want?" The planchette moved quickly now, like it was eager to answer. SILENCE, silence. What did that mean? "Silence from us, is that it?" I asked, though my gut twisted with dread. The planchette jerked again, more forceful this time, spelling out another word. FORGET. "They want us to forget," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "They don't want us talking about this. About them." I stared at the board, the weight of the words sinking in. That's what this had been about all along. The warnings, the threats. They didn't want us investigating. We had stumbled onto something we weren't supposed to know, and now they were trying to erase us, to make us disappear like all the others. We can't forget, I said, shaking my head. We can't let them get away with this. Before I could say anything else, the planchette moved again, fast and sharp. Toolate. The lights in the house flickered, and that familiar hum returned, louder than ever. The room felt like it was closing in on us, the shadows deepening as the air grew colder. I could feel them now, whatever they were. They were here, in the house. Emily stood up abruptly, backing away from the board. We need to go. Now. But before we could move, the front door slammed shut on its own, the sound echoing through the house. My heart raced, panic flooding my veins. The hum grew louder, and I could feel it pressing against my skull, like it was trying to get inside my head. The planchette moved one last time, slowly spelling out its final message. Gone. The lights flickered once more, and then everything went dark. For a long moment, there was only silence. No hum, no movement, just the overwhelming quiet that seemed to stretch out forever. And then, I heard it. A voice, low and mechanical, coming from the shadows. You shouldn't have asked. Emily screamed, and we bolted for the door, throwing it open and stumbling out into the night. We didn't stop running until we were far away from the house, our lungs burning, our hearts pounding in our chests. I haven't been back since. I don't know what happened to Matt, or to Jake. I don't know if they're still out there or if they're gone. But I do know one thing. Whatever we connected with that night, it's still watching, still waiting, and no matter where I go, no matter how hard I try to forget, I can still feel them. In the shadows, in the silence, in the quiet moments when I'm alone. They're always watching. And I know, deep down, that they'll come for me too. This all started as a joke. One of those things you do with your friends just for fun. Not because you believe in it, but because it's something to laugh about later. If I'd known what would happen, I never would have touched that Ouija board. It was a regular Friday night, and me, my best friend Mark, and his girlfriend Sarah were hanging out at their place. We didn't have much planned beyond watching a movie and ordering pizza, but Sarah had recently found an old Ouija board in her parents' attic and brought it out. I remember laughing when she placed it on the coffee table like it was some kind of ancient artifact. Come on, seriously? I chuckled, leaning back on the couch. You don't actually believe in this stuff, do you? Mark grinned, but Sarah just shrugged. I don't know. My mum used to say weird things about it. She claimed it wasn't just about contacting spirits. Some people used it for other stuff. Other stuff? I asked, raising an eyebrow. Sarah's voice dropped to that kind of spooky, dramatic tone people use when they're telling a ghost story around a campfire. She said it's not just the dead that talk through these things. Sometimes people contact things from other worlds, beings that don't belong here. We all laughed, but there was something in Sarah's eyes that told me she wasn't entirely joking. Still, none of us were taking it too seriously. We dimmed the lights, set up the board, and sat down with our fingers on the planchette. Mark was the first to ask the typical question. Is there anyone here with us? Nothing. Not a single twitch. We all let out a collective sigh of relief, half disappointed, half relieved that nothing spooky had happened. But then Sarah, in her usual mischievous way, leaned forward, her voice dropping again. Let's ask something different. What if we ask it about something we've never heard of? Something from, I don't know, somewhere else. I frowned. Like what? Like aliens. Mark laughed, but I could see the glint of excitement in his eyes. He loved this kind of stuff. Conspiracy theories, government cover-ups. He'd spend hours on Reddit threads diving into theories about UFOs and secret experiments. All right, he said, grinning. Let's see if we can get an alien on the line. I wasn't sure why, but the air in the room felt different as soon as he said that. It was like the weight shifted, just a little. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the atmosphere getting to me. We put our fingers back on the planchette, and Sarah asked, "Is there anything from another world listening?" At first, nothing happened. The planchette sat there, still as ever, and we all exchanged awkward glances, ready to laugh it off and move on. Then it moved. Slowly, the planchette began to glide across the board, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. None of us were pushing it, I swear. It spelled out a single word: yes. We all froze, staring at the board. I laughed nervously, but my voice sounded shaky. "Okay, who's messing around?" Mark shook his head, his face pale. "Dude, I swear, I didn't do that." Sarah just stared at the board, her fingers trembling slightly. "Ask it something else," she whispered. Mark nodded and leaned forward. "Where are you from?" The planchette started moving again, faster this time, and it began to spell out something strange, something none of us recognized. XHULNAR. We all looked at each other, confused. "Shulna," I asked. "What's that?" Sarah pulled out her phone and started Googling the word. Nothing. No results. It wasn't a name. It wasn't a place. It wasn't anything. At least nothing on the internet. "Maybe it's an alien planet," Mark joked, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. He was nervous too. I glanced at the board, feeling a strange sense of unease growing inside me. "Okay, enough of this. Let's stop." But Sarah shook her head, still curious. "No, wait. What if it's trying to tell us something? Let's ask it what it wants." I didn't like the idea, but before I could protest, Sarah asked the question. "What do you want from us?" The planchette moved again, slower this time, like it was thinking. It spelled out another word, one that sent a chill down my spine. LISTEN. The lights flickered as soon as the word was completed, just for a second, but it was enough to make all of us jump. The room felt colder, and I had the distinct feeling that something was watching us. "Listen to what?" Mark asked, his voice shaking now. The planchette didn't move. The board went silent, the room heavy with tension. We sat there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. Finally, I stood up, wiping my hands on my jeans. "Okay, I'm done. That's enough for one night." Mark and Sarah agreed, and we packed the board away, making awkward small talk to try and shake off the weirdness of what had just happened. But I couldn't shake that uneasy feeling that something was wrong, that we had touched on something we shouldn't have. That night I went home, trying to push the whole thing out of my mind. But as I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about the word the board had spelled. Shulna. What did it mean? Was it just random letters, or had we actually contacted something else? Then, around 3 a.m., I woke up to a sound. It wasn't loud, but it was there, right at the edge of my hearing. A faint, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the window. I sat up, my heart racing, and listened closely. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, like someone was knocking just lightly enough to be heard. I didn't move. I just stared at the window, the darkness outside feeling suddenly alive. I don't know how long I stayed like that, frozen in place, but eventually the tapping stopped. The room fell silent, but the unease lingered. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I texted Mark and Sarah, telling them about what I'd heard. Mark laughed it off, saying it was probably a tree branch hitting the window. Sarah didn't say much, just replied with, "That's weird." But it wasn't just weird. It was terrifying. Because later that day, I found something on my window that hadn't been there before. Etched faintly into the glass, barely visible unless you looked closely, was a symbol. A symbol that looked like something I'd never seen before, almost like an ancient language. The same kind of language I imagined an alien would use. I couldn't stop staring at the symbol. It was faint, almost invisible unless the light hit it just right, but it was there, etched into the glass of my bedroom window. At first, I thought it was just a smudge, maybe a streak from condensation or dirt. But no, it was too deliberate for that. The lines were thin, curved in ways that didn't make sense, like some ancient alien script. I stood there for what felt like hours, tracing the shape with my eyes, trying to make sense of it. It was intricate, like something you'd see in a forgotten temple, not scratched into the window of my small apartment. The worst part? I knew it wasn't there before. I tried to convince myself that maybe I just hadn't noticed it. Maybe I was overreacting after what happened with the Ouija board. But no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, a part of me knew this wasn't normal. This wasn't natural. I took a picture of the symbol and sent it to Mark and Sarah. I wanted to believe that one of them had snuck over during the night, that this was just some prank they were pulling on me. But the more I stared at the image on my phone, the more that feeling of unease grew. Mark replied first. "Dude, that's freaky. Did you figure out what it means?" I hadn't even considered looking it up yet. The thought of finding out that it meant something real, unnerved me. But after Mark's text, I started searching. I tried everything: Google, ancient symbols databases, even some conspiracy theory forums Mark had once shown me. Nothing came up. The symbol didn't exist anywhere. A few minutes later, Sarah responded. Her message was short, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. "I've seen this before." I immediately called her. The phone rang for what felt like forever before she finally picked up. "Where?" I asked, skipping the pleasantries. "Where have you seen it?" Sarah's voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "Remember my mum's stories? The stuff about the Ouija board? She used to talk about symbols like this. She said they weren't human." "What do you mean, not human?" I asked, my pulse quickening. Sarah paused for a long moment before continuing. She said some people, when they mess with things they shouldn't, start seeing symbols. She said they're warnings or invitations. It's like something's marking you. I swallowed hard. Marking me for what? Sarah didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know." That was the last thing I wanted to hear. We talked for a little longer, but it didn't make me feel any better. If anything, the conversation just left me more unsettled. I hung up, staring at the symbol on my window. Marked. The word stuck in my head like a splinter, digging deeper with every second. That night, the tapping returned. It was faint, just like before, but this time, it didn't stop. It was steady, relentless, like someone or something was outside, knocking at the window, just out of sight. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore it, but it was impossible. Every knock sent a shiver down my spine. I wanted to look, to pull back the curtains and see what was out there, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Eventually, I sat up, my heart pounding. I grabbed my phone and opened the camera, slowly aiming it toward the window. The tapping was louder now, almost rhythmic, like a pulse. My hands were shaking as I took a picture, then another, not daring to look directly at the glass. When I finally gathered the courage to check the photos, I felt the blood drain from my face. In the first photo, the symbol was still there, but it looked different. It was brighter, almost glowing, and there were more of them. Smaller symbols scattered around the edges of the glass, faint but unmistakable. But it was the second photo that made my stomach turn. There was a shadow, a shape, standing just outside the window. It wasn't a person. Not exactly. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form barely visible in the dim light. I couldn't make out any features, just a vague outline, but I knew it wasn't human. I dropped the phone, my breath catching in my throat. The tapping stopped. For the rest of the night, I didn't move. I stayed in bed, pulling the blankets up over my head like a child hiding from a nightmare, hoping that whatever was outside would go away. Morning couldn't come fast enough. The next day, I went straight to Mark's place. I needed to get out of my apartment, away from the window and the symbols. As soon as I walked in, Mark took one look at my face and knew something was wrong. "Dude, you look like you've seen a ghost," he said, trying to lighten the mood, but there was a nervous edge to his voice. I showed him the photos. His face paled as he stared at the shadow in the second image. "What the hell is that?" "I don't know," I admitted, my voice shaking. "It was just there. I didn't see it with my own eyes, only in the photo." We sat in silence for a few minutes, the weight of what was happening pressing down on us. Finally, Mark spoke. "Maybe we should go back to the Ouija board." "No way," I said immediately. "We're not messing with that thing again." Mark ran a hand through his hair, pacing the room. "But what if it's the only way to figure out what's happening? Maybe we didn't ask the right questions. Maybe we need to go deeper. Or maybe we just need to stop before things get worse," I shot back. But the truth was, it was already too late. The symbols, the shadow, I couldn't just ignore them. Something was happening, something far beyond anything I could understand, and as much as I didn't want to admit it, I knew Mark was right. We needed answers. Reluctantly, I agreed to go back to Sarah's place that night. We'd try the Ouija board again, but this time we'd be more careful. That evening, as I sat in Mark's car on the way to Sarah's, I felt a knot of dread forming in my stomach. Every shadow we passed, every flicker of movement outside the window made me jump. I kept thinking about the shape I'd seen in the photo, the tall, inhuman figure standing just outside my window, waiting. What if it was following us? What if it was already here? Invisible, but watching. When we arrived, Sarah was already waiting for us. The Ouija board laid out on the table, just like the last time. I sat down, my hands trembling as we placed our fingers on the planchette. "Okay," Mark said, his voice steady but tense. "Let's figure out what this thing wants." As soon as we started, the board seemed to come alive. The planchette moved faster this time, more deliberate, like whatever we had contacted was eager to speak. Mark asked the first question, his voice low and serious. "What are you?" The planchette moved quickly, spelling out a single word that made my heart stop. "Watching." Sarah's eyes widened, and I felt my chest tighten. Watching? Watching what? Us. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to ask the next question, though every instinct screamed at me to stop. "What do you want?" The planchette slid across the board, spelling out something that sent a chill through my entire body. "Follow." I leaned back, my pulse racing. "Follow? Follow where?" The planchette kept moving, faster and faster, spelling out more words, but they were in that same alien language as before. Symbols and letters I couldn't understand, but the message was clear. Whatever we had contacted, it wasn't done with us, and it wanted us to follow. That night, after we finished with the Ouija board, none of us spoke much. We were too rattled. Mark drove me home, and as soon as I stepped through the door of my apartment, I locked everything behind me, twice. It didn't make me feel any safer. The whole place felt different, like the shadows were thicker, the corners of the room darker. I knew sleep wasn't happening that night, so I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the window where the symbol had been etched. It was still there, faint but unmistakable. The air was so quiet that every little noise, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards, made me jump. And then, around midnight, I heard something new. A knock. It wasn't loud, just a single sharp tap, like someone gently knocking on a door. But it wasn't coming from my door. It was coming from the window. The same window where the symbol had appeared. My heart raced and I froze, barely breathing as I listened. There it was again. Tap. I stood up slowly, inching toward the window, every step feeling like I was walking deeper into something I shouldn't be a part of. I didn't want to look. Every instinct screamed at me to just turn away, to ignore it, but I couldn't. I had to know what was out there. I reached the window, my hand hovering over the edge of the curtain. With one quick movement, I pulled it back. Nothing. There was nothing outside but the empty street, bathed in the dim light of a street lamp. No shadowy figure, no glowing eyes, no alien presence. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, relief washing over me. And then I saw it. On the other side of the glass, just above where the original symbol had been etched, was a new one. It was smaller, but just as intricate, the lines sharper, more deliberate. I couldn't stop staring at it, a sick feeling growing in my stomach. Whatever had left the first symbol hadn't gone. It was still here, watching, marking me again. I stepped back from the window, my hands shaking, and grabbed my phone. I snapped a picture of the new symbol, my fingers trembling so badly that it took a few tries to get a clear shot. As soon as I had the photo, I texted it to Mark and Sarah. "It's back." Mark replied within seconds. "What's back?" I didn't even have the energy to explain. "The symbol, another one, it's on my window." There was a long pause before he replied again. "Dude, you need to get out of there." That was the problem though. Where was I supposed to go? This thing, it wasn't bound by walls or locks. It had already made that clear. I wasn't sure running would help. I spent the rest of the night pacing my apartment, jumping at every small sound. Every time I passed the window, I felt like I was being watched, even though there was nothing there. I knew it sounded crazy, but it was like the air itself had eyes, like something was waiting, just out of sight, for me to make a mistake. At some point, exhaustion must have taken over, because I found myself waking up on the couch, the weak morning light filtering through the blinds. For a second, I almost believed the worst was over, almost, until I checked my phone. There was a message waiting for me. No number, no contact info, just a blank screen with a single line of text. "We see you." I stared at the words, my blood running cold. I tried to call Mark and Sarah, but both of their phones went straight to voicemail. I texted them over and over, but there was no response. Panic set in. Something wasn't right. I couldn't just sit there waiting for whatever was happening to get worse. I grabbed my keys and left my apartment, hoping that getting out, getting fresh air, would help clear my head. I walked around the neighborhood, trying to focus on normal things. Cars driving by, people walking their dogs. It helped, but only for a little while. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. And that's when I noticed them. At first, it was subtle, just the feeling of someone watching me from a distance. Then I saw them. Figures, standing on the opposite side of the street. They weren't doing anything, just standing there, facing me, like they were waiting for something. I couldn't make out their faces from where I stood, but I knew they were watching me. Their bodies were too still, too deliberate. I tried to convince myself it was just paranoia. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe I was just on edge after everything that had happened. But when I started walking again, they moved too. They didn't follow me directly. They stayed on the other side of the street, always keeping a distance. But they matched my pace, moving when I moved, stopping when I stopped. I turned corners, ducked into alleyways, trying to lose them, but they were always there, just far enough away to stay hidden, but close enough that I couldn't ignore them. I rushed back to my apartment, slamming the door behind me and locking it. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I checked the windows, but there was nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation that they were out there, waiting. Later that evening, Mark finally called me back. His voice was shaky, more scared than I'd ever heard him before. "I've been seeing them too," he said. "Everywhere I go, there are these people. They don't say anything, they don't get too close, but they're always there. I think it's connected to the Ouija board. I think we've been marked." My stomach dropped. Mark hadn't mentioned anything to me before, but the fact that he was experiencing the same thing only confirmed my worst fears. Sarah's been acting weird, Mark continued, his voice wavering. She won't talk to me anymore, and she's been locking herself in her room for hours. I think she's seeing them too. What are they? I asked, barely able to get the words out. What do they want? I don't know, Mark whispered, but I don't think they're human. The line went dead after that, and no matter how many times I tried to call him back, he didn't pick up. That night, the tapping returned. This time, it was louder, more insistent. It wasn't just coming from the window anymore. It was coming from the walls, from the ceiling, like the whole apartment was surrounded, like they were trying to get in. I sat on the floor, clutching my phone, heart racing, listening to the tapping grow louder and louder until it felt like it was coming from inside my head. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence was deafening, and for a moment, I thought maybe it was over. Maybe whatever had been tormenting me had finally given up. But when I looked up, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the wall, etched into the paint, was the same symbol from my window. It hadn't been there before, I was sure of it. But now it was there, glowing faintly in the dim light of my apartment. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw them. Figures standing just outside my window, watching. I couldn't move. My body froze as I stared at the figures outside the window. They were there, just barely visible in the faint glow of the streetlight. Tall, motionless and watching, always watching. Their faces were hidden in shadow, but I could feel their gaze, heavy and unblinking, as if they were waiting for me to acknowledge them. I don't know how long I stood there, heart pounding, my breath shallow. It felt like time had stopped. But then, slowly, they began to move. Not toward me, just shifting, almost imperceptibly, like they were adjusting their stance, waiting for something to happen. The tapping from earlier echoed in my mind, louder now, though I couldn't hear it anymore. It was like a presence, a rhythm I couldn't escape. I backed away from the window, keeping my eyes on them as I grabbed my phone. My hands shook so badly I could barely dial Mark's number. It rang once, twice, then went straight to voicemail. "Mark, it's me," I whispered into the phone, my voice trembling. "They're outside. I don't know what to do. Call me back, please." I hung up, trying to steady my breathing, but the panic was setting in. Every corner of the room felt like it was closing in on me. The air was thick, suffocating, like I was being smothered by something I couldn't see. That's when I noticed the symbol on the wall had changed. The symbol that had been etched there earlier was glowing brighter now, pulsating faintly, as if it was alive. The lines seemed to shift, almost like they were moving, rearranging themselves. I stepped closer, my mind racing. I could barely process what I was seeing, but I knew it wasn't right. It was like the symbol was trying to communicate, but in a way that wasn't meant for me to understand. And then I heard the voice. It wasn't loud, but it was there, faint, like a whisper carried on the wind. But it wasn't coming from the outside. It was coming from inside the apartment, from everywhere at once. "We are here!" I froze. The voice was hollow, emotionless, and alien. It didn't sound like anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't human. My pulse quickened, and I backed away, my heart thudding in my chest. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Another voice, similar but slightly different, followed. "You are marked." I clutched my head, squeezing my eyes shut, hoping that maybe this was all just some kind of waking nightmare, that I'd open my eyes and everything would be normal again. But I could feel it, the presence in the room, like the air itself had come alive, pressing down on me. When I opened my eyes, the figures were no longer outside. They were inside. I don't know how they got in. The doors were locked, the windows closed, but it didn't matter. They were standing in the corners of the room, tall and dark, just beyond the edge of my vision. I couldn't see them clearly, not unless I looked directly at them, but I could feel them. They were real, standing there, surrounding me. The air grew colder, almost icy, and I could see my breath fogging up in front of me. The tapping sound returned, louder now, coming from all around me, echoing through the room. But this time, it wasn't just tapping, it was footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, coming from the shadows, circling me. I backed up against the wall, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. I was trapped. The voices returned, louder this time, overlapping each other, a chorus of whispers that filled the room. You have been chosen. We are watching. Follow. My vision blurred, the room spinning as the voices grew louder, more insistent. The figures in the corners began to shift, their forms becoming more defined, but still just out of focus, as if they were barely tethered to this reality. I could see their movements now, slow, calculated, like predators sizing up their prey. I stumbled toward the door, my body shaking uncontrollably. My hand fumbled with the lock, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get it open. The door wouldn't budge. It was as if the room itself was working against me, trapping me inside with them. The voices grew louder, almost deafening now, repeating the same words over and over again. You are marked. We see you, I screamed, an animalistic, terrified sound that echoed off the walls, but it didn't stop the voices. The figures moved closer, their shapes still blurred, but I could feel their presence growing stronger, filling the room with an unbearable weight. I fell to the floor, my back against the wall, gasping for breath. The air was thick, suffocating, like I was being pressed down by an invisible force. The symbol on the wall glowed brighter, pulsating with an otherworldly light that filled the room. And then, the tapping stopped. The figures were gone. Just like that, they vanished, leaving behind nothing but the cold, empty silence. The room felt normal again, like the nightmare had never happened. But I knew it wasn't over, not even close. My phone buzzed, snapping me back to reality. I fumbled for it, my hands shaking as I read the message that appeared on the screen. It was from Mark. They're with me too. I don't know how much time we have left. I stared at the message, my heart sinking. The dread I'd been feeling for days had solidified into something worse, something tangible. Whatever we had contacted, whatever we had brought into our lives, it wasn't going to stop. We were marked, and they were with us, always watching, always waiting. As I sat there in the silence, I realized that it didn't matter where I went or how far I tried to run. They were with me now, and they weren't going away. I wasn't alone anymore. I sat there on the cold floor, phone in hand, staring at Mark's message. My body was trembling, my mind racing with questions I didn't want to ask, let alone answer. The silence around me was suffocating, pressing in like a weight I couldn't shake. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight. All I knew was that the figures were still out there, watching, waiting for something I couldn't understand. The message from Mark lingered on my screen, and all I could think was, we don't have much time. But time for what? What were we supposed to do? I wanted to scream, wanted to run, but I knew it wouldn't make a difference. They'd follow. They were always with us now. I texted Mark back. What do we do? Seconds ticked by, each one dragging out longer than the last. My heart raced as I waited, but no response came. The silence was deafening, the room growing colder with every passing moment. I couldn't take it anymore. I dialed Mark's number, the ringing filling the void of the room. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3. Then it clicked. But it wasn't Mark's voice that answered. It wasn't even human. I froze, the phone pressed to my ear as a faint whisper came through the line, distorted, guttural, and wrong. The words were hard to make out, like they weren't meant to be spoken by a human tongue, but I understood them all the same. You were chosen. The whisper echoed in my head, louder now, as if the voice was right next to me. My stomach churned, and I dropped the phone, backing away from it like it was toxic. The voice didn't stop. It repeated the same words over and over again, filling the air with that same sickening sense of dread. You were chosen. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. My legs felt like lead, frozen in place as the voice grew louder, more insistent. It was inside my head now, rattling around like an echo I couldn't shake. The symbols on the wall glowed brighter, pulsing with that same eerie light, like they were responding to the voice. They twisted, morphed, becoming more complex, more intricate, as if they were alive. And then the voice stopped. Everything went still. For a moment I thought it was over, that whatever had been tormenting me had finally left. But then, slowly, I became aware of something else. The air felt different again, heavier, charged with a presence I hadn't noticed before. My skin prickled as a low hum filled the room, not like a sound, but a vibration that I could feel in my bones. I turned, and that's when I saw it. They were back, not just in the corners of the room this time. Number. They were closer, right there, standing in front of me, 3 tall, dark figures, their forms still blurred, still not entirely real, but undeniably there. My breath caught in my throat, and my body went rigid. The figures didn't move. They just stood there, staring, their outlines shimmering like a mirage, just out of focus. But I could feel them. I could feel the weight of their gaze, the cold emptiness that radiated from them. They weren't human, that much was clear. They were something else, something ancient and terrifying, and I had no idea what they wanted. But then, one of them stepped forward. It moved slowly, almost gracefully, as if it wasn't bound by the same laws of physics that I was. The room felt like it stretched, warping around the figure as it came closer. I tried to move, to scream, but nothing happened. I was trapped in place, my body refusing to obey. The figure stopped just inches from me, its face still a blur, but I could feel its presence like a physical force. It reached out, its hand, if you could call it that, hovering just above my chest. And then, without warning, it touched me. The moment its fingers, or whatever they were, made contact, a shock of pain shot through my body. My vision blurred, my mind filled with an overwhelming surge of images, flashes of symbols, stars, and something far worse. I saw a place, a vast emptiness, a black void stretching into infinity. And in that void, there were others like the figures, countless of them, moving through the darkness like shadows. And then I heard the voice again, clearer this time, more direct. You belong to us. The images faded, but the pain didn't. It was like something was being torn out of me, like my very essence was being pulled apart, piece by piece. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could feel was the cold, empty presence of the figures as they stood over me, watching, waiting. The light from the symbols on the wall grew blinding, and the room itself seemed to fade away, swallowed by the same darkness I had seen in my mind. I was floating now, lost in that void, surrounded by the figures, by their whispers. They were everywhere, inside me, around me, part of me. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The figures were gone. The symbols faded. The room returned to its normal state, dim and quiet. I was alone again, lying on the floor, gasping for breath, my body trembling uncontrollably. But I knew nothing would ever be normal again. I stumbled to my feet, my mind reeling. I didn't know what had just happened, didn't fully understand what I had seen or experienced. But one thing was clear. I was no longer the same. I had been marked, chosen for something far beyond my understanding, something ancient and alien. I grabbed my phone and texted Mark, my hands still shaking. We need to talk. They've taken something from me. No response. I dialed his number, but it went straight to voicemail again. Panic surged through me, and I tried Sarah's number. Nothing. No one was answering. I felt that same sickening sense of dread creeping up my spine. I grabbed my keys, threw on a jacket, and rushed out of my apartment, heading to Mark's place. I had to see him, had to make sure he was okay. But deep down, I knew whatever had happened to me was happening to him too. When I got to Mark's building, I pounded on his door. No answer. I called his name, louder this time, but the silence was all that greeted me. After what felt like an eternity, I tried the door handle. It was unlocked. I stepped inside, my heart racing, my breath shallow, and then I saw it. On the floor, in the middle of Mark's living room, was the same glowing symbol. And in the center of that symbol, standing perfectly still, was Mark. He wasn't moving. His eyes were open, but they were blank, lifeless. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his body seemed different, hollow, like something vital had been taken from him. I called his name again, but he didn't respond. He didn't even blink. He just stood there, staring straight ahead, as if he wasn't really there anymore. And then I heard it, the tapping. It was coming from behind me. I turned, slowly, my entire body trembling, and saw them. The figures, standing there, watching, waiting. They weren't done yet.